So it's good to be here. Good to discuss some of the next generation capabilities that are coming with Wi-Fi. I was watching Detlef's presentation, and I had to say that I am not aware of a modern stadium or a new deployment that has not deployed Wi-Fi in their stadium. In fact, they become very dependent on it, which I think is what Detlef was showing. And I wanted to just look at not only the amount of traffic that is being done over the stadium, but what does it take from a latency characteristic? How is it that you can use an unlicensed technology that has thousands of APs all deployed in this big bowl where interference is everywhere? RF is bouncing around all over through the stadium. How is it that you can get a predictable experience for these next generation applications? Because it wasn't too long ago where you might say this couldn't be done in Wi-Fi, but yet it's Wi-Fi that's being deployed for all these next generation use cases. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Stadium as well and some of the things that we're seeing. It's interesting that Detlef brought up SoFi Stadium because I can't help but talk about it as well, because there's literally hundreds of stadiums that we could talk about, but I wanted to look at what does the next generation of stadium look like? What is it that they're trying to achieve? And so you see something like this. This is nearly 300 acres. So what happens when you have to light up all of that? You know what? They're lighting up the indoor. They're lighting up the outdoor. When you go to these football games, you know what they do? They call it tailgating. They have picnics out there. They arrive 2 hours early. They're connecting. They're watching the pregame information. All of this is connected, and it's connected through Wi-Fi access. But it's not just Wi-Fi access. It's Wi-Fi access converged with intelligent IoT technologies, that's converged with private 5G and DAS type technologies. And you know what? They can benefit each other. So I want to talk a little bit about that convergence and what it is that we have to accomplish in these next generation stadiums. So if you go inside the stadium, you'll see one of the biggest screens ever created. That screen that's hanging from the ceiling in SoFi is 2.2 million pounds. 2.2 million pounds. It is 4K resolution. It's that giant oval shape. It's got a screen on the inside. It's got a screen on the outside. And because of that, they can immediately react to what's going on in the audience, and they can do replay, all of those things. But everything that's going up on that screen, you know where else they can put it? They can put it into your handset. So here you have a capacity of, as you can see here, 70,000. In fact, this stadium can be reconfigured to actually handle over 100,000 for big events like the Super Bowl, other large concepts, Olympics, things like that. Now, what is it that's changing about these stadiums? Well, you can see it here. This is a 100% cashless stadium. Everything is a digital interaction. It is completely ticketless. You don't have to bring your paper ticket. Everything is done through digital, from the entry to getting into the parking lot to purchasing concessions. In fact, it is all integrated to the point where you can get your concessions brought to you in your seat. Why and how do they know where your seat is? Well, they not only know the seat number, but they know where you're currently standing, because location services tells them where to bring the food. Whether you're sitting in some of the concession areas, you're sitting at a table, or whether you're sitting in your seat, now they know exactly where to bring the food. It is a completely converged network. All sales, all the TV cameras, and they have hundreds of screens all around the arena so that when you're walking around, you can see what's going on in these different sporting events. All the collaboration, even the team networks, are done on this common Wi-Fi. Do you know when the teams show up, they have their own networks for communicating between the owners, the guys up in the stands, the guys that are doing the coaching. All that is connected and converged on this single access network. Now, this is one that was only built, in fact, it only went into commission this last year. Again, 28 acres, 1.25 million square feet. And you can see it's got this outdoor plaza around it. Same thing. They want to connect all the connectivity indoors and out. Now, this is one of the biggest double-sided video boards that's ever been installed in an arena. This digital board actually uses AI to react to the fans. So if the fans get all excited, what's displayed up on this video board changes based on what's currently going on in the game. And in fact, they can sense the excitement of the fans, and then those are the clips that they retain for replay. And where can you pick up those replays? You can pick it up on your handset. In fact, they want this to be completely immersive and interactive. So what they're doing now is they're saying, say it's a football game, say it's a basketball game. Let's take football, American football. Sorry. So what you can do is you can actually say, I think the next play, I think the coach is going to tell them to run on the next play. I think it's going to be a pass. I think it's going to go to this receiver. And so by participating in that way, you become immersed in the experience. And if you're right, you earn points. And at the end of the game, the person that most closely called the game, or the set of people that most closely called the game to how the coach actually coached the game, wins an award. So now you can see here the audience is sucked in. They become part of the sporting event. That's the type of immersion that we're talking about. They're doing the same thing. Everything is digital, ticketing, purchasing, and the branding. There is not a single sign in here that is a paper or a wallpaper type sign, all digital signage, which means that you can change that signage for whatever event that you're doing immediately just by pushing the new capabilities and technology. So that's what they're doing in this next generation. It was interesting, Detloff was showing even the overlay for doing things like 3G services. And these are done on Wi-Fi networks. So how is it that we make this work? Well, Wi-Fi has really changed. Wi-Fi, what's the Cadillac commercial? They used to say that, today's Cadillac isn't your father's Cadillac, with the idea it's much better now. It's the same thing. Wi-Fi now isn't the Wi-Fi that we're used to. A lot of us, when we think of Wi-Fi, especially from the service provider community, a lot of us think of Wi-Fi as this best effort technology. But over the last several years, with the advent of Wi-Fi 6 and going to OFDMA, now we can actually schedule in the frequency domain. You know what the other technology is that's based on OFDMA at the lower layer? 5G. So now we're leveraging common technologies in order to get the most that we can get out of these networks. And that overlap means that we're better prepared to converge these technologies for the best experience. Now what's happened, as we see if you go to the right here, I'm looking at latency. This is a high density network, and we're talking about very high density. If you were to send that traffic, high density at high utilization in these stadiums, in the past, Wi-Fi 5, this is what you'd get on the left. And this is only 3 nines reliability. 3 nines reliability, you're seeing cases where you're getting up over 250 milliseconds. You know it doesn't work very well at 250 milliseconds? Voice. And especially not these AR/VR applications like Detloff was showing with the goggles. Can't work. You'll feel disoriented. It'll skip. It'll fall behind. But look at what happens when we start taking into account multi-link operation, TUA, restricted TWT. That same traffic pattern that we had on Wi-Fi 5 can now be managed to sub 50 milliseconds, sub 20 milliseconds, 1 millisecond. So this Wi-Fi, this generation of Wi-Fi, can be deterministic. It can react to the interference that's on the network. It can send traffic reliably, and this gets extended even further, as Szymanski was showing earlier, on Wi-Fi 8. So not only can we start to do these carrier class, and why do I call it carrier class as we get into these latencies? Because if we can do carrier class, then we can use a carrier identity, a SIM card, an eSIM, to authenticate into the Wi-Fi networks and get that carrier class experience. And we get it because we deploy Wi-Fi dense. You know, we always talk about spectrum. You know how you get more capacity? Well, you can throw spectrum at it. And spectrum, as everyone has said in this conference, is limited. Do you know how else you get capacity? You densify. And you know what is deployed very dense by nature? Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is dense. Now we have to protect for that density, and so we do that applying some of these next generation capabilities. So I just want to show you, Cisco's been making smart antennas for a very long time. And our latest announcement is this Wi-Fi 7 antenna. And what these antennas do, and Detlef had a good picture of this, is they direct the RF almost like a spotlight. In fact, what our latest antenna is doing is it allows you to beam steer that spotlight. And so what that enables is you to isolate spectrum AP to AP to AP. So just like in this environment, when you look up on the ceiling here, you see that AP? That's a Cisco AP right there. You know what it's doing? It's that AP, actually, right here on the diagram. And what you're doing is you're shining that spectrum down in a 70, 70, or a 60-degree arc, because it's based on the height of the ceiling. And so you see that AP there is separated from this AP right here. And because they're shining down, they don't have to interfere with each other, which means as you spread these different APs out, and you see them back here, there's probably 10 different APs doing this directional antenna capability right here in this room. And it's the same thing that we're doing in Stadium, because if we shine it down like a spotlight, then that AP is not interfering with that AP. And these APs aren't interfering with the APs out there in the hall or in the next room. And because of that, we can use the spectrum over and over and over again. And that's what we do in the stadiums. And as Detlef was saying, you can put these APs, you can put them under the seat, or you can put them up above. In fact, Cisco has technologies where we're actually putting them in the railings. So as you're walking down to your seats, you can put the antennas and the APs in the railings, and they're shining side to side. So there's a lot of ways to manage the spectrum in order to get the throughput that these next generation stadiums demand. In our latest AP, not only can you do the broader aperture, the 70-degree, but now you can do 5, 6, and 7 gigahertz, and you can actually do it with a 35-degree aperture. What does that mean? You can put them higher in the ceiling. And in fact, what we can do is we call it hyper-directional AP. Once you've installed it, it's very hard to go out there and to start turning it like that to make sure that it's pointing in exactly the right spot, that you're shining that spotlight like RF in the right location. So what we do is we allow you to install it, and then through the software algorithms steer that beam so that you get the least interference and you get the best coverage across that stadium implementation. Now what we've done with this antenna, and I wanted to just take a second to talk about this, is that this antenna can do LPI, it can be installed indoors, it can be installed outdoors, and it can do standard power. We are ready to do standard power now. This antenna was introduced this last year. Sometimes I hear that we don't see as much standard power as we'd like to see, and it's not ramping up as fast. Well, that's because the vendors were catching up and actually building the equipment to do it. It's here. It's here. LPI, you can seal this antenna, you can make it waterproof, and you can put it outdoors. So, I was thinking about skipping this one, but I'll digress for just a second. This is a comparison of under-the-seat antennas where you're using omnis and the interference that you get seat to seat versus doing an overhead directional antenna. This is the difference between doing a spotlight of RF and doing radio resource management so that you can manage that spectrum experience. Look at the difference in that the channel interference between under the seat and overhead. So it's these next generation type capabilities that really enable us to do these in a very open environment in a very effective way. Now here's an example where this is a Napa Valley music festival. And I know I'm deviating a little bit from sports, but I just wanted to show the application where we're using this antenna both indoors and out. We're using standard power. Now this was a combination of standard power, Wi-Fi 7, using the AFC and using open roaming. So you know what happened at this festival? These folks showed up, and they were already connected to 5G. They were already connected to 5G when they drove out there. As soon as they went on to this area, this campus, for this festival, they immediately and automatically and securely connected to Wi-Fi. They didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to go to a portal. They didn't have to put in their email address. They didn't have to get out their credit card. They just automatically and securely connected to Wi-Fi. How many of you automatically and securely connected to Wi-Fi in here? Wasn't the greatest experience, was it? These next generation technologies enable us to do it because you know what? When you go to 5G, do you have to go to a connection manager? Do you have to pick your network? Do you have to put in a password? You don't have to do any of those things. You know why? Because the roaming agreements are negotiated between the 600, 700 operators around the world to automatically allow for your connectivity to just connect. It's behind the scenes. You don't care. You connect. Open roaming does that for Wi-Fi. It uses pass-pointed technology to connect you wherever you go using the credentials that are already on your phone. Well, you're saying, I have credentials on my phone? If you have an iPhone, it's got an Apple credential. Probably has a Google credential. Probably has a Facebook credential. You know what else it has? eSIMs and SIMs. It has an operator credential. And if you use those operator credentials, those are good, secure credentials that can allow you to connect without you having to manually do it. And so when we start doing that, do you know what we've seen in these deployments? Because we're doing this in stadium, we're doing this in venues. You know what we're seeing? We're seeing the typical 20 to 25% attach rate to Wi-Fi, which happens if you have to go through a portal. As soon as you start using credentials like operator credentials or these other credentials that are already on your device, Wi-Fi connectivity jumps to 90, 95%. Automatically, securely, to give you the best experience. And so these are the types of technologies that are happening. So I talked a little bit about open roaming. What open roaming does is it allows any access network to use any credential through a common federation. You might say, well, who's in the federation? You know what the federation really is? It's just a certificate authority. And so certificates are issued both to the access network and to the IDPs. What I just told you what IDPs were. IDPs are your operator. It's the AT&Ts, it's the Vodafones, it's the Oranges, right? It's the Comcasts. It's these different credential holders, and you can use any of those credentials that are already on your device now to securely connect to any access network. Now this is important. It's important that we have this abstraction. Why? Because if you don't abstract this, then you have to negotiate all of these roaming agreements manually. Now, like I said, if you have a 5G network and you're roaming with other 5G networks, what happens? You have to negotiate 600, 700 roaming relationships. Do you know how many Wi-Fi guest access networks there are out there around the globe? There's over 600 million. We would keep lawyers in business forever if we had to have them negotiate all these roaming agreements. And that's not what we're about. So we have to abstract this. We have to make it automatic. And that's the experience you want coming into a stadium. As soon as you get onto the parking lot, you connect to the Wi-Fi. As soon as you go through the door, you're automatically recognized, and you don't even have to pass a ticket. You're admitted into the facility. And this immersive experience in these sporting venues all become possible because now you're all automatically and securely connecting into the network. So we do this. We've been doing this for a long time. Our partners over the Fira de Barcelona, we've been doing open roaming. They were one of the first implementations that we ever did. And we have this phenomenal experience because you know it's at the Fira de Barcelona every year. It's Mobile World Congress. It's one of the biggest events there. They have over 100,000 people that show up for Mobile World Congress. And you know what they do in order to give the best experience and to have the capacity you need for that event? They combine the DAS systems, they combine microcells, and they combine the Wi-Fi access network to give you all the different type of services, the location-based services, the wayfinding-based services, the data services that you need there. And what we see here is that the traffic just keeps growing. We get this little burp due to COVID in these middle years, but you can see year on year, the average traffic per user continues to go up. Now, what happened at Mobile World Congress is that we started to implement 6 gigahertz these last couple of years. And more of the network is going to 6 gigahertz, but you know, it's in Barcelona. So how much spectrum do you have in Barcelona? You have 480 megahertz. So because you have 480 megahertz, all these APs that are on the ceiling and all the exhibitors are all using Wi-Fi in order to show their different capabilities, to do their demos, to connect to the network. And what happens? They all have to share the spectrum. So in order to share that spectrum, in order to isolate into different channels so that people aren't interfering with people, you know what we had to do? We had to do what Monisha Ghosh told us earlier. We had to go right back down to 20 megahertz channels. That wasn't the goal for 6 gigahertz. We don't want to go back to 20 megahertz channels. In these high density implementations, we want to go to 40 megahertz channels. We want to go to 80 megahertz channels. We want to provide a better experience. We want to have higher burst rates. We want to have better latency characteristics because we're not colliding and backing off. That's what these next generation sports arenas need. That's what these next generation venues need. So the spectrum becomes critical to the experience. The amount of bandwidth you can get and the latency characteristics that are going to be exhibited on that network. I wanted to talk about one other convergence technology, shift gears a little bit here. You know, as we make the Wi-Fi networks more capable, as we make the 5G, 6G networks more capable, sometimes I think the industry looks at this as competing because we start to see this overlap in these technologies. I would put to you that the overlap of the technologies is an opportunity to converge them, to use both in their strengths, and they do have strengths. Now, one service that's on just about every 5G network or cellular network that's deployed out there is emergency services. But there's times when you're in building that the 5G can't reach you. You're in the basement, you're in the elevator, you're blocked behind a stairwell. So what we're doing, and this is happening over at the WBA, and my friends over at the WBA and Tiago is going to talk about this in more detail, we're implementing and we're documenting and we're building architectures to do emergency services on Wi-Fi. So why do I bring it up when I'm talking about convergence? Because I think emergency services are a convergence service. We need it on Wi-Fi, we need it on 5G, and if you do both, the resiliency of the system goes way up. You should be able to call and do an emergency call wherever you are using whatever technology is available to you. So we break this down into a couple of different areas. Emergency calling in the US 911, in Europe 112. If you dial that number, say you're in a building like here, and say you didn't have the password to the Wi-Fi, or say you weren't using open roaming. What we're doing is that if you dial the emergency number, there is an emergency profile available to you that will connect to any Wi-Fi for one and only one purpose, to make the emergency call. Do you know what we need to do that? We need the regulator support. We need the regulator support. Regulators can regulate this. The technology is there, but the regulators need to enable this. So we want to be able to automatically call. Now what happens? You make the call and the ambulance or the police, let's take the ambulance example, they arrive. Well, what do they need to do? Well, if you just made the call on Wi-Fi because you were in an area in a building that 5G couldn't reach, the emergency services need to connect. The ambulance needs to connect back to the hospital, to the doctor. The fireman needs to connect to the truck that's out by the street. So what you do is that same emergency profile that allows you to connect to any network for doing a 911 or an emergency call would also connect the responders automatically and securely. And in fact, the network would prioritize that traffic because it's an emergency service. You know what we need to do that? We need regulators. We need regulators to enable us to do these types of services. Last one, what about emergency warning system? You're in a mall. I've had this happen, or I've experienced. I was in a mall. My little boy was with me. I was looking at some jeans, and I turned around, and he was gone. Everyone's nightmare, right? And I saw the entrance to the mall, and I saw the door to the parking lot, and I'm like, if I go the wrong way, I may never see him again. That's what's apparent. That's what goes through your head, right? That's definitely what goes through your head. So these types of systems, Amber, well, I'll tell you the end of the story. So, I'm sitting there and I start yelling his name. His name is Ian. I say, Ian, Ian, Ian. Well, then, as a parent, you go into panic mode and you start screaming Ian. And then all of a sudden I heard this giggle, and he was hiding in one of those circular clothes racks. And I was very relieved to see him, but I said, come here so I can kill you. Don't ever do that to me again. But even the warning systems, the emergency alert systems, we can connect this to Wi-Fi. We should reach all those devices. What if it's a tablet? What if it's only a Wi-Fi device? We should reach all those devices for those types of emergency and capabilities. This is a convergence technology. It doesn't replace cellular, it enhances cellular. In fact, Wi-Fi, because it's got FTM in every chipset, can figure out the location of you and your device within 1 meter. So when the responders come to that emergency call, where do they go? Wi-Fi can tell them exactly where the emergency is. In fact, if the emergency call is done on 5G, Wi-Fi can give a more accurate location to the 5G emergency call, because we're converging these solutions and using them in their strengths. So I'm very excited about what's happening in Wi-Fi. I'm very excited about what's happening in convergence. I believe that Wi-Fi is not the enemy. I think in many cases it's the answer. In fact, 5G is the answer to Wi-Fi coverage. You know what? Because Wi-Fi is never going to be out there when you're doing 120 kilometers down the road. Wi-Fi is never going to cover an entire country. Cellular is going to do that. But because of the density that Wi-Fi has, and again, remember, how do you get more capacity? It's spectrum or it's densification. Wi-Fi is dense. Wi-Fi is the answer to densification, because it's a distributed business model. Who paid for the Wi-Fi in here? Probably the venue. And so we need to combine these together, and convergence is the answer for access going forward. So when we're doing these spectrum debates, I know that we get very adamant in one pole or another, but what we want to do is allocate spectrum based on the pole, based on where we're using these technologies most of the time, based on where we're moving most of the data, and based on uniting into this converged implementation. So with that, I'll wind up, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of idea where we are at CISCO.